I came home from work to find my lawn dead, not just a little brown completely lifeless. A sickly yellow hue had spread over the once green grass, and the stench of chemicals burned my nose. I clenched my fists. This wasn't some accident. This was sabotage. The HOA had been on my back ever since I refused to replace my perfectly fine wooden fence with one of their overpriced, mandatory, approved vinyl ones. I knew they didn't like me pushing back, but this was a new level of petty. A slow clap echoed from my driveway. "Oh dear, Malcolm," came the shrill voice of Nancy Mercer, the HOA president. She stood there in her usual pastel cardigan, arms crossed, a smug look on her face. "What a shame about your lawn. It's almost like neglect." I exhaled sharply through my nose. "We both know this wasn't neglect, Nancy." She put on a fake sympathetic look. "The HOA takes violations very seriously. Dead grass, that's a hefty fine. Should I just add it to your growing list?" I took a step forward. "You poisoned my lawn," Nancy gasped theatrically. "Oh my." Accusations like that could get you into trouble. I knew better than to argue with her. She thrived on control and intimidation, but I wasn't about to back down. I spent the next few days gathering evidence. My security cameras caught a shadowy figure sneaking around my yard late at night right near the sprinkler system. I sent soil samples to a testing lab. Pesticides, the kind that kill grass but not weeds, were found in high concentrations. Someone had deliberately sabotaged my property. I knew who it was, but proving it in a way that would make Nancy pay, that was going to take something bigger. That's when I stumbled across something interesting. While researching HOA regulations, I found a property ownership map of the neighborhood. And there, in the fine print, was a revelation. The HOA's irrigation system wasn't connected to the city water supply. They got their water from a private well, one that was technically on land just outside the HOA boundaries, a land parcel that was up for sale. I barely stopped myself from laughing. Nancy poisoned my lawn, fine. I was about to choke off her entire kingdom. I called the realtor the same day. The realtor was eager to make a sale. The land the well sat on had been listed for months with no serious buyers. It seemed nobody wanted a small, oddly shaped parcel of land with nothing but a pump house on it. But for me, it was perfect. I made an offer immediately, and within a week, the paperwork was finalized. The property was officially mine. Now came the fun part. I drove to the pump house early in the morning, before the HOA's landscapers arrived to start their daily watering routine. The pump was old but functional, humming along as it pulled water from the well and fed it into the irrigation system that kept the neighborhood's common areas and select properties lush and green. I turned the valve. The machinery groaned as I shut off the flow completely. By the time I got back home, the damage was already starting. The early summer heat was brutal, and without water, the HOA's pristine flower beds and carefully maintained lawns wouldn't last long. I sat on my porch, sipping my coffee as I watched Nancy and a few of her board members pace around the community entrance, staring at the wilting flower beds. It didn't take long for Nancy to march up my driveway. Her face was red, her carefully styled hair slightly frizzed from the heat. She didn't bother with fake pleasantries this time. "The irrigation system isn't working," she snapped. "Do you know anything about it?" I leaned back in my chair, taking my time before answering. "Oh, I know exactly why it's not working." Her expression darkened. "Well." I pulled out a copy of the property deed and unfolded it slowly, letting her see the official stamp of ownership. "I bought the land the well sits on, the water source for the HOA. It's mine now." Nancy snatched the paper from my hands and scanned it, her face tightening as she read. "This has to be a mistake," she muttered. "This land is part of the HOA's infrastructure." "Actually, it never was," I said. "The HOA's water source has always been on private property. The previous owner just never cared enough to do anything about it, but I do." She looked up from the paper, eyes blazing. "You can't just shut off the water. The entire community depends on it," I shrugged. "Sure I can, my property, my well. Besides, I seem to recall you being very big on rules." If I remember correctly, the HOA handbook clearly states that all homeowners are responsible for maintaining their own water sources. Guess that applies to the HOA too. Nancy inhaled sharply, nostrils flaring. "You're doing this out of spite." I smiled. "No, I'm doing this because you poisoned my lawn and then tried to fine me for it. Actions have consequences, Nancy." She seemed to struggle for a response, her lips pressing into a thin line. Then, without another word, she turned on her heel and stormed off. Over the next few days, the effects of the water cutoff became more and more noticeable. The once perfectly green lawns in front of the HOA's offices turned patchy and brown. The community entrance, which Nancy prided herself on keeping pristine, looked neglected. Residents started asking questions. At first, Nancy tried to downplay the issue, insisting it was a minor irrigation problem that would be fixed soon. But as the days stretched on and the grass turned brittle, frustration grew. Homeowners who relied on the HOA's water for their own yards were furious. That's when the complaints started rolling in. Residents showed up at HOA meetings demanding answers. Some were angry, others were panicked, worried that their property values would plummet if the neighborhood started looking run down. Nancy tried to maintain control, but it was clear she was losing her grip. Then came the emergency HOA meeting. I made sure to attend, taking a seat right in the front row. Nancy stood at the podium, her usual confidence replaced with barely concealed anxiety. "We are working on a solution to the temporary water problem," she announced, her voice strained. "Negotiations are in place to restore service as soon as possible." I raised my hand. She hesitated, then begrudgingly nodded at me. "Are you referring to negotiations with me?" I asked, leaning back in my chair. "Because as the legal owner of the well, I haven't been contacted about any such discussion." A murmur spread through the room. Nancy's jaw tightened. "We are exploring all options," she said. "You mean you're scrambling because you assumed you owned something you never actually did," I said. "And now that you're caught, you don't know what to do." More murmurs. A few residents turned to each other, whispering. Nancy's face darkened. "You're deliberately sabotaging this community." I leaned forward. "No, Nancy, you sabotaged me first. And now you're facing the consequences of your own actions." One of the other board members, an older man with graying hair, cleared his throat. "Malcolm, is there any way we can work out a deal?" I tapped my chin, pretending to think about it. "Maybe, but first I want something in writing. A full admission from the HOA that my lawn was tampered with, and I want the fines you tried to hit me with revoked." Nancy looked like she wanted to explode. The board members exchanged glances, realizing they had no leverage. The older man nodded slowly. "That seems reasonable." Nancy's lips pressed into a thin line. She clearly hated every second of this, but she had no choice. "Fine," she spat. "Great," I said. "Once I have that in writing, we can talk about water access." Nancy glared at me, but I saw the defeat in her eyes. She had lost. And it was only the beginning. Nancy's glare could have set fire to the already withering grass outside. She clearly wanted to argue, but she had no ground left to stand on. The board members exchanged uneasy glances, realizing they had no choice but to concede. The older board member, the one who had asked if we could work out a deal, exhaled and nodded. "We'll get the paperwork drawn up immediately." Nancy's mouth twitched, but she forced a stiff nod. I stood and adjusted my jacket. "I'll be expecting it by tomorrow, if not, well." I gestured vaguely toward the dried-out landscaping outside the HOA office. "I'm sure the residents will love seeing how much worse things can get." A few people in the crowd muttered to each other, while others simply sat in stunned silence, absorbing the reality of the situation. I left the meeting with a sense of satisfaction, but I wasn't about to let my guard down. I knew Nancy well enough to expect retaliation. The next morning, before I even had a chance to check my email for the promised paperwork, a loud knock rattled my front door. I opened it to find two men in suits standing on my porch. One of them, a tall, thin man with a sharp nose, held up a folder. "I'm attorney James Caldwell, representing the Homeowners Association," he said without preamble. "You've unlawfully shut off an essential service to the community, and we're prepared to take legal action." I leaned against the doorframe, unimpressed. "Unlawfully?" The second man, a stockier figure with graying hair, stepped forward. "The HOA is considering an injunction to force you to restore water access immediately." I crossed my arms. Considering, that means you don't have one yet, which tells me you know you don't have a case. Caldwell's eyes narrowed. It's common sense. You can't just cut off water to an entire neighborhood. I tilted my head. I didn't cut off water to the neighborhood, just to the HOA's irrigation system. Every home has its own city water supply. I haven't touched that. The stocky man hesitated, but Caldwell pressed on. This will go to court, I sighed, taking out my phone. Then I guess I'll have to make my own legal preparations. I dialed a number and put it on speaker. The phone rang twice before a voice answered. Malcolm, to what do I owe the pleasure? Hey, David. I've got some HOA lawyers at my door threatening legal action over my well. David chuckled. They do realize you legally own that, right? Caldwell's expression tightened. Oh, they realize it, I said. They're just hoping to intimidate me into turning the water back on. David let out a dramatic sigh. Tell them if they want to take this to court, they'll have to explain why the HOA illegally relied on a resource they didn't own for years. And if they try to claim it as essential, they'll have to prove they had a legal agreement with the previous landowner, which they didn't. Caldwell's lips pressed into a thin line. There's no need to escalate this, he said stiffly. I arched an eyebrow. I'm not the one who brought lawyers to my doorstep. The stocky man cleared his throat. Perhaps we should step back and reconsider our approach. Caldwell's jaw clenched, but he nodded. We'll be in touch. They turned and left, clearly frustrated. I shut the door and exhaled. As expected, Nancy had tried to strong-arm her way out of the mess, but it hadn't worked. That afternoon, my email pinged with an attachment. The document was exactly what I'd demanded: an official HOA statement admitting that my lawn had been tampered with, and a full revocation of the fines they had issued. I printed it, signed my copy, and drove straight to the HOA office. When I walked in, Nancy was seated at her desk, her expression sour. She barely looked up as I handed her the papers. There, signed and sealed, I said. Now about the water situation. She set the papers aside, her fingers tightening around the edges. What do you want? I took a seat across from her. For starters, I'm willing to sell water access back to the HOA, but at a price. She scoffed. You can't be serious. I smiled. Oh, I'm very serious. You need my well, and I'm willing to lease access under my terms. She folded her arms. And those terms are? I slid another document across the desk. First, the HOA will refund every homeowner who paid for the mandatory vinyl fence replacements. Her nostrils flared. That's thousands of dollars. Second, I continued, you will resign as HOA president. She shot to her feet. Absolutely not, I leaned back. Then I guess the drought continues. She trembled with barely contained rage. You're blackmailing me, I shrugged. Call it what you want. But I'm offering a way out of this mess before the entire neighborhood turns against you. She sat back down, her fingers tapping against the desk. You think they'll care enough to force me out? I smirked. Why don't we find out? That evening, I posted in the neighborhood forum, outlining everything: the poisoned lawn, the irrigation shutdown, the legal threats, and my conditions for restoring the water. The reaction was immediate. Homeowners were furious, not at me, but at Nancy. People who had been forced to pay for those overpriced fences demanded refunds. Others were outraged that the HOA had relied on an unowned water source for years without securing a proper agreement. By morning, a petition to remove Nancy from her position was circulating. Within 2 days, it had enough signatures to force a recall vote. Nancy fought it, of course. She tried blaming me, tried shifting responsibility to the board, but it didn't matter. The residents had made up their minds. At the next HOA meeting, the vote was held. She lost. As she stormed out, I caught her eye one last time. She looked at me with pure hatred, but beneath it, there was something else. Defeat. I leaned in just enough for her to hear me. Actions have consequences, Nancy. She said nothing, just turned and left. With her gone, the new board quickly agreed to my terms. The fences were refunded, and I signed the agreement to restore water access at a reasonable cost, of course. Within weeks, the neighborhood was looking green again. And best of all, the HOA had learned a valuable lesson. Mess with me, and I'll make sure they regret it. With Nancy gone, the neighborhood settled into an uneasy calm. The new HOA president, a man named Richard Hale, was more measured in his approach. He had been on the board for years, but had mostly stayed in the background while Nancy ran things like a dictatorship. Now, he had no choice but to take the reins. I wasn't naive enough to think the HOA would suddenly become my best friend, but Richard at least seemed to understand that fighting me wasn't in his best interest. A week after Nancy's departure, Richard showed up at my doorstep. He was a tall man with a perpetually tired look, his salt and pepper hair slightly disheveled. He held a folder under one arm, shifting his weight uncomfortably. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. I gestured toward the porch chairs. "Go ahead." He sat, rubbing his temples before setting the folder on the table. "I won't waste your time. The HOA is in trouble." I leaned back. "Trouble of their own making," Richard sighed. "I won't argue that, but I need you to understand how deep this goes. Nancy ran things recklessly. The HOA's finances are a mess. We've been operating on the assumption that we controlled the irrigation system, and now that we don't, we have no backup plan. If we don't start paying for water access immediately, we're going to start losing more than just landscaping." I studied him. "You're telling me the HOA doesn't have the money to cover the lease?" He hesitated, then nodded. "Not enough. The reserve fund is nearly drained. Nancy spent HOA dues on ridiculous vanity projects, expensive entrance signs, decorative statues, and unnecessary legal fights. She funneled money into things that made the neighborhood look impressive on paper while ignoring actual infrastructure." I exhaled slowly. "And now that reality has caught up, you want me to cut you a break?" Richard held up a hand. "I'm not asking for charity, I'm asking for time. We need to raise fees just to get basic services running again, and that's not going to go over well with homeowners who just fought to get rid of Nancy. If we suddenly announce an increase, people will revolt." I considered him. He wasn't trying to manipulate me the way Nancy had. He was desperate but not scheming. That made him easier to deal with. "How much time?" I asked. "A few months. Enough to restructure the budget, cut unnecessary expenses, and start collecting dues properly." I wasn't about to give in completely, but I also didn't want the neighborhood collapsing. A dysfunctional HOA meant property values could tank, and as much as I enjoyed watching them scramble, I didn't want my own investments suffering. "Fine," I said. "I'll give you 60 days before payments kick in, but after that, full price, no negotiations." Richard exhaled in relief. "That's more than fair." I wasn't done. "And I want full transparency on HOA finances from now on. No more secret budgets, no more backdoor deals. I want to know exactly where the money is going." Richard nodded without hesitation. "Agreed. Honestly, I wanted to do that anyway. I don't want to run things like Nancy did." I watched him carefully, searching for any sign of deception, but he seemed genuine. "Then we have a deal," I said. Richard extended a hand and I shook it. Over the next few weeks, the HOA underwent a dramatic shift. Residents who had previously been afraid to challenge the board started attending meetings, demanding accountability. With Nancy gone, people finally felt like they had a voice. Then came the audit. One of the first things Richard did was order a full review of the HOA's finances, and what they found was worse than anyone expected. Nancy hadn't just mismanaged funds, she had outright embezzled them. Tens of thousands of dollars were unaccounted for. Unauthorized withdrawals, inflated invoices, and payments to non-existent contractors painted a clear picture of corruption. Richard wasted no time calling a special meeting to reveal the findings. The room was packed, tension hanging thick in the air. Richard stood at the front, holding a stack of papers. "We have undeniable proof that Nancy Mercer misappropriated HOA funds. Some of the money went to personal expenses, some to shady business deals, and some simply vanished." A murmur spread through the crowd. People exchanged shocked glances, some looking furious, others simply stunned. One homeowner, a man named Greg, stood up. "So what happens now? She's gone, but that money is still missing." Richard nodded. "We're filing charges. The board has already contacted law enforcement, and an investigation is underway. If convicted, Nancy will face serious consequences." A woman near the back scoffed. "Great, but that doesn't get our money back." I stood. "Actually, it might." All eyes turned to me. If Nancy used HOA funds for personal expenses, that means there's a paper trail. Bank accounts, assets, maybe even property purchases. If the court rules in our favor, we can go after her assets to recover the stolen money. Richard nodded. Exactly. It won't be quick, but we're pursuing every legal avenue available. The room buzzed with conversation. Some residents were still angry, but there was a sense of hope that hadn't been there before. As the meeting wrapped up, Richard approached me. "I don't know if I ever thanked you properly," he said. "For standing up to Nancy, for exposing her." I shrugged. "I didn't do it for the HOA, I did it because she tried to screw me over." Richard chuckled. "Fair enough, but still, this neighborhood is better off because of it." I didn't argue. He wasn't wrong. A few weeks later, Nancy was officially arrested. The news spread quickly, and the neighborhood erupted in celebration. Some people even threw a party, complete with a mock Nancy's retirement cake. With her gone and the HOA under new leadership, things finally started improving. Fees were adjusted to reasonable levels, unnecessary fines were eliminated, and homeowners actually had a say in how the community was run. As for me, I kept my well, but I made sure the HOA never took it for granted again. They paid their dues on time every time, and if they ever forgot who really held the power, well, I could always turn the water off again. With Nancy gone and the HOA scrambling to recover from her financial mess, things around the neighborhood settled into a new rhythm. The once oppressive atmosphere had shifted, and for the first time in years, homeowners weren't walking on eggshells. People who had once kept their heads down were now speaking up at meetings, asking questions, and holding the board accountable. It was a welcome change. Still, I wasn't about to let my guard down. The HOA had a long history of shady dealings, and even with Richard at the helm, I knew better than to assume everything would run smoothly. My agreement with them for water had been put in place, and they were sticking to the payment plan for now. But I had learned one thing from my battle with Nancy. Power-hungry HOA boards had a way of bouncing back when you least expected it. My suspicion was confirmed when I received an unexpected message from one of the newer board members, a woman named Lisa. She was one of the few people on the board who had been openly critical of Nancy even before her downfall, and she had earned a reputation for being blunt and pragmatic. She asked if we could meet privately, away from the HOA office. That was my first red flag. If she didn't want to talk in an official capacity, that meant there was something she didn't want the rest of the board to hear. We met at a small coffee shop just outside the neighborhood. Lisa was already seated at a corner table, looking uneasy. She gestured for me to sit and immediately got to the point. "There's something you need to see," she said, sliding a folder across the table. I opened it and scanned the contents. At first glance, it looked like a routine set of meeting minutes, but as I read further, a pit formed in my stomach. The board had been holding private discussions without informing homeowners about securing a new water source. The problem? The plan involved annexing an adjacent property and claiming eminent domain over it. I looked up. "They're trying to steal someone else's land," Lisa nodded. "They're claiming it's for community infrastructure, but that's just an excuse. They don't want to be dependent on you anymore, and instead of negotiating in good faith, they're looking for ways to cut you out entirely." I flipped through the pages again, noting the signatures. Richard was among them. I clenched my jaw, feeling a familiar surge of anger. I had given him the benefit of the doubt, but it seemed old HOA habits died hard. Lisa lowered her voice. "I don't think they'll get away with it, not legally, but they're determined. They've already reached out to a lawyer who specializes in land acquisitions. If they find a loophole, they'll use it." I exhaled sharply. "They really don't learn, do they?" She shook her head. "I thought things would change after Nancy, but some of them just see this as a power struggle. They don't like that you outmaneuvered them, and now they're trying to take back control." I leaned back in my chair, thinking, if they were looking for a way to secure their own water source, then they were clearly feeling the pressure. That meant I still had leverage. The question was how to use it. Lisa hesitated before speaking again. "I don't know what your next move is, but whatever you do, be careful. Richard isn't Nancy, but that doesn't mean he won't play dirty if he thinks he can win." I nodded. "Thanks for the warning," she sighed, rubbing her temples. I just want to see this neighborhood run fairly for once. No more backroom deals, no more power grabs. I closed the folder and stood. Then let's make sure that happens. Over the next few days, I did my own digging. I found out exactly which property the HOA was eyeing: a small, undeveloped plot of land on the far edge of the community, owned by an elderly couple who had lived there for decades. The HOA's plan was clear: claim the land as a necessary acquisition for community infrastructure, push the couple out, and build their own well. I wasn't about to let that happen. Instead of waiting for them to make their move, I went straight to the property owners. I explained everything: the HOA's intentions, their history of underhanded tactics, and the legal loopholes they were trying to exploit. The couple, understandably, was furious. They had no intention of selling, but they also didn't have the resources to fight a prolonged legal battle. That's where I came in. By the end of the conversation, we had a deal. I would buy the land from them at a fair price, ensuring the HOA couldn't touch it. In exchange, they could remain on the property as long as they wanted, with full protections against any HOA interference. When the paperwork was finalized, I made sure the HOA found out immediately. The next HOA meeting was tense. Richard sat at the head of the table, looking more agitated than I had ever seen him. The rest of the board members were stiff, avoiding eye contact. I didn't wait for formalities. I dropped a copy of the land deed onto the table and leaned forward. "Looks like your little plan just fell apart." Richard's jaw tightened as he picked up the document and skimmed it. His face darkened. "You bought it." I crossed my arms. "That's right. And now, just like with the well, if you want access to that land, you're going to have to go through me." A murmur spread through the room. Some board members looked relieved, while others seemed ready to explode. Richard set the papers down slowly. "You're making this personal," I laughed. "You tried to steal land from an elderly couple just to avoid dealing with me. This isn't personal, it's justice." A younger board member cleared his throat. "So, what now?" I shrugged. "That depends on you. If you're willing to operate fairly, we can work something out. But if you try any more underhanded tactics, I'll make sure the entire community knows exactly what you're up to again." Richard held my gaze for a long moment before exhaling sharply. "Fine." I wasn't convinced yet, but at least for now, they had no choice but to back down. As I walked out of the meeting, Lisa caught up to me. "You really don't hesitate, do you?" I glanced at her. "Not when dealing with people like them." She smiled slightly. "Good. I think they finally got the message." I wasn't so sure about that, but one thing was certain. As long as I was here, the HOA would never get away with their schemes again. Richard sat at the head of the HOA meeting table, his usual composure replaced with a rigid, forced calm. The board members beside him were stiff, their previous arrogance noticeably absent. The reality of my latest move had hit them hard. I leaned against the back wall, arms crossed, watching their discomfort with quiet satisfaction. The land they had plotted to take was now locked down under my ownership, and with it, any hope they had of securing their own well had evaporated. Richard finally spoke, his voice measured. "We need to move forward." I didn't respond immediately, letting the weight of the situation settle over the board. They were cornered, and they knew it. Lisa, seated at the far end of the table, tapped her fingers against the wood. "I agree. It's time for the board to focus on actual community improvements instead of these constant power struggles." Richard exhaled through his nose. "We were trying to create a sustainable solution." I pushed off the wall. "No, you were trying to cut me out after I gave you a fair deal." There's nothing sustainable about deception. A few board members exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, an older woman who had mostly stayed quiet during the previous meetings, cleared her throat. "We can't afford another mistake like this. The homeowners are already on edge after Nancy's fiasco. If they find out we attempted another shady land grab, it'll be chaos." Richard's fingers drummed against the table. "Then we need to find a way to stabilize things without drawing more attention." I pulled a chair back and sat. "That's easy. You honor the agreement we already have, make your payments on time, and stop trying to play games." Lisa nodded. "It's the only way forward." Richard's mouth pressed into a thin line. He didn't like it, but he wasn't in a position to argue. After a long pause, he gave a curt nod. "Fine. That should have been the end of it, but I knew better. Over the next few weeks, I kept a close eye on the HOA. They made their scheduled payments for water access, but something felt off. Homeowners were still wary, and whispers of frustration spread through the neighborhood. Then I found out why. Lisa called me one evening, her voice tight with frustration. "You need to see this." She sent over a document, an internal HOA memo that had been leaked. I skimmed through it, my irritation growing with every line. Richard and the board had quietly introduced a new set of fees, labeling them as community infrastructure maintenance costs. They hadn't announced them publicly, instead slipping them into the next wave of dues invoices. I clenched my jaw. They were trying to recoup the money they had lost when their land grab failed by squeezing it out of homeowners. Without wasting time, I printed out the memo and headed straight to Richard's house. He opened the door, surprised to see me. "What do you?" I held up the printout. "Care to explain this?" He hesitated, then stepped aside, motioning for me to come in. I followed him into his living room where stacks of paperwork were scattered across a coffee table. Richard rubbed his temples. "It's not what you think." I set the paper down in front of him. "It looks exactly like what I think. You lost your shot at a private well, so now you're squeezing homeowners to make up for it." He shook his head. "We need funds to maintain the common areas. The budget is stretched thin." I narrowed my eyes. "Then be transparent about it. You don't sneak in extra fees and hope no one notices." Richard sighed, his frustration evident. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under. Everyone expects me to clean up the mess Nancy left, but they also expect me to keep dues low. It's impossible." I crossed my arms. "Then do it the right way. If you need more money, take it to the homeowners. Let them decide instead of forcing it on them without warning." He looked away, silent for a moment. "They wouldn't approve it," I scoffed. "So your solution is to trick them instead?" Richard exhaled sharply. "I don't have a better option." I leaned forward. "Yes, you do. You admit what you did, roll back the fees, and actually work with the community instead of against them." He ran a hand through his graying hair. "And if I don't?" I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Then I'll make sure every homeowner knows exactly what you're doing, and trust me, they won't take it lightly." Richard studied me for a long moment, then with obvious reluctance he nodded. "Fine." The next day, the HOA issued an official statement retracting the hidden fees. Richard held an emergency meeting, admitting his mistake and promising to be more transparent moving forward. The homeowners weren't happy, but they appreciated the honesty, especially after Nancy's reign of deception. For the first time in a long while, it felt like the HOA was finally learning its lesson. Lisa caught up with me after the meeting, shaking her head. "I don't think Richard expected you to push back so hard." I shrugged. "He should have," she smirked. "You know you could run for a board position. With everything you've done, people would probably vote you in." I laughed. "Not a chance. I'd rather keep them on their toes from the outside." She chuckled. "Fair enough." As I walked back home, I took a deep breath, letting the tension fade. The HOA had tried every trick in the book: sabotage, legal threats, shady deals, but in the end, they had lost. And as long as I was here, they would never pull something like this again.